Chapter 20, Part 3 of Book 8 of Les Misérables, Volume 3 by Victor Hugo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Catherine Eastman. Les Misérables, Volume 3 by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 8, The Wicked Poor Man. Chapter 20, The Trap, Part 3. Marius waited in a state of anxiety that was augmented by every trifle. The enigma was more impenetrable than ever. Who was this little one whom Thénardier had called the Lark? Was she his Ursule? The prisoner had not seemed to be affected by that word, the Lark, and had replied in the most natural manner in the world, "I do not know what you mean." On the other hand, the two letters UF were explained. They meant Urbain Fabre, and Ursule was no longer named Ursule. This was what Marius perceived most clearly of all. A sort of horrible fascination held him nailed to his post, from which he was observing and commanding this whole scene. There he stood, almost incapable of movement or reflection, as though annihilated by the abominable things viewed at such close quarters. He waited in the hope of some incident, no matter of what nature, since he could not collect his thoughts and did not know upon what course to decide. "In any case," he said, "if she is the Lark, I shall see her, for the Thénardier woman is to bring her hither. That will be the end, and then I will give my life and my blood, if necessary, but I will deliver her. Nothing shall stop me." Nearly half an hour passed in this manner. Thénardier seemed to be absorbed in gloomy reflections. The prisoner did not stir. Still, Marius fancied that at intervals, and for the last few moments, he had heard a faint, dull noise in the direction of the prisoner. All at once, Thénardier addressed the prisoner. "By the way, Monsieur Fabre, I might as well say it to you at once." These few words appeared to be the beginning of an explanation. Marius strained his ears. "My wife will be back shortly. Don't get impatient. I think that the Lark really is your daughter, and it seems to me quite natural that you should keep her. Only listen to me a bit. My wife will go and hunt her up with your letter. I told my wife to dress herself in the way she did, so that your young lady might make no difficulty about following her. They will both enter the carriage with my comrade behind. Somewhere outside the barrier there is a trap harnessed to two very good horses. Your young lady will be taken to it. She will alight from the fiacre. My comrade will enter the other vehicle with her, and my wife will come back here to tell us it's done. As for the young lady, no harm will be done to her. The trap will conduct her to a place where she will be quiet, and just as soon as you have handed over to me those little 200,000 francs, she will be returned to you. If you have me arrested, my comrade will give a turn of his thumb to the Lark. That's all." The prisoner uttered not a syllable. After a pause, Thénardier continued. "It's very simple, as you see. There'll be no harm done unless you wish that there should be harm done. I'm telling you how things stand. I warn you so that you may be prepared." He paused. The prisoner did not break the silence, and Thénardier resumed. "As soon as my wife returns and says to me, 'The Lark is on the way,' we will release you, and you will be free to go and sleep at home. You see that our intentions are not evil." Terrible images passed through Marius's mind. What? That young girl whom they were abducting was not to be brought back? One of those monsters was to bear her off into the darkness? Whither? And what if it were she? It was clear that it was she. Marius felt his heart stop beating. What was he to do? Discharge the pistol? Place all those scoundrels in the hands of justice? But the horrible man with a meat-axe would, none the less, be out of reach with the young girl, and Marius reflected on Thénardier's words, of which he perceived the bloody significance. "If you have me arrested, my comrade will give a turn of his thumb to the lark." Now it was not alone by the colonel's testament, it was by his own love, it was by the peril of the one he loved, that he felt himself restrained. This frightful situation, which had already lasted above half an hour, was changing its aspect every moment. Marius had sufficient strength of mind to review in succession all the most heartbreaking conjectures, seeking hope, and finding none. The tumult of his thoughts contrasted with the funereal silence of the den. In the midst of this silence, the door at the bottom of the staircase was heard to open and shut again. The prisoner made a movement in his bonds. "Here's the bourgeoise," said Thénardier. He had hardly uttered the words when the Thénardier woman did in fact rush hastily into the room, red, panting, breathless, with flaming eyes, and cried as she smote her huge hands on her thighs simultaneously, "False address!" The ruffian who had gone with her made his appearance behind her, and picked up his axe again. She resumed, "Nobody there! Rue Saint-Dominique, number 17? No, Monsieur Urbain Fabre, they know not what it means." She paused, choking, then went on. "Monsieur Thénardier, that old fellow has duped you. You are too good, you see. If it had been me, I'd have chopped the beast in 4 quarters to begin with. And if he had acted ugly, I'd have boiled him alive. He would have been obliged to speak, and say where the girl is, and where he keeps his shiners. That's the way I should have managed matters. People are perfectly right when they say that men are a deal stupider than women. Nobody at number 17. It's nothing but a big carriage gate. No Monsieur Fabre in the Rue Saint-Dominique. And after all that racing and fee to the coachman and all, I spoke to both the porter and the portress, a fine, stout woman, and they know nothing about him." Marius breathed freely once more. She, Ursule, or the lark, he no longer knew what to call her, was safe. While his exasperated wife vociferated, Thénardier had seated himself on the table. For several minutes he uttered not a word, but swung his right foot, which hung down, and stared at the brazier with an air of savage reverie. Finally he said to the prisoner, with a slow and singularly ferocious tone, "A false address? What did you expect to gain by that?" "To gain time!" cried the prisoner in a thundering voice, and at the same instant he shook off his bonds. They were cut. The prisoner was only attached to the bed now by one leg. Before the 7 men had time to collect their senses and dash forward, he had bent down into the fireplace, had stretched out his hand to the brazier, and had then straightened himself up again, and now Thénardier, the female Thénardier, and the ruffians, huddled in amazement at the extremity of the hovel, stared at him in stupefaction, as, almost free and in a formidable attitude, he brandished above his head the red-hot chisel, which emitted a threatening glow. The judicial examination to which the ambush in the Gorbeau house eventually gave rise established the fact that a large sou piece, cut and worked in a peculiar fashion, was found in the garret when the police made their descent on it. This sou piece was one of those marvels of industry which are engendered by the patience of the galleys in the shadows and for the shadows, marvels which are nothing else than instruments of escape. These hideous and delicate products of wonderful art are to jewelers' work what the metaphors of slang are to poetry. There are Benvenuto Cellinis in the galleys, just as there are Villons in language. The unhappy wretch who aspires to deliverance finds means sometimes without tools, sometimes with a common wooden-handled knife, to saw a sou into 2 thin plates, to hollow out these plates without affecting the coinage stamp, and to make a furrow on the edge of the sou in such a manner that the plates will adhere again. This can be screwed together and unscrewed at will. It is a box. In this box he hides a watch-spring, and this watch-spring, properly handled, cuts good-sized chains and bars of iron. The unfortunate convict is supposed to possess merely a sou. Not at all. He possesses liberty. It was a large sou of this sort which, during the subsequent search of the police, was found under the bed near the window. They also found a tiny saw of blue steel, which would fit the sou. It is probable that the prisoner had this sou piece on his person at the moment when the ruffians searched him, that he contrived to conceal it in his hand, and that afterward, having his right hand free, he unscrewed it and used it as a saw to cut the cords which fastened him, which would explain the faint noise and almost imperceptible movements which Marius had observed. As he had not been able to bend down, for fear of betraying himself, he had not cut the bonds of his left leg. The ruffians had recovered from their first surprise. "Be easy," said Bigrenaille to Thénardier. "He still holds by one leg, and he can't get away, I'll answer for that. I tied that paw for him." In the meanwhile, the prisoner had begun to speak. "You are wretches, but my life is not worth the trouble of defending it. When you think that you can make me speak, that you can make me write what I do not choose to write, that you can make me say what I do not choose to say—" He stripped up his left sleeve and added, "See here." At the same moment he extended his arm and laid the glowing chisel which he held in his left hand by its wooden handle on his bare flesh. The crackling of the burning flesh became audible, and the odor peculiar to chambers of torture filled the hovel. Marius reeled in utter horror. The very ruffians shuddered. Hardly a muscle of the old man's face contracted, and while the red-hot iron sank into the smoking wound, impassive and almost august, he fixed on Thénardier his beautiful glance, in which there was no hatred, and where suffering vanished in serene majesty. With grand and lofty natures, the revolts of the flesh and the senses, when subjected to physical suffering, cause the soul to spring forth, and make it appear on the brow, just as rebellions among the soldiery force the captain to show himself. "Wretches," said he, "have no more fear of me than I have for you." And tearing the chisel from the wound, he hurled it through the window, which had been left open. The horrible, glowing tool disappeared into the night, whirling as it flew, and fell far away on the snow. The prisoner resumed. "Do what you please with me." He was disarmed. "Seize him," said Thénardier. 2 of the ruffians laid their hands on his shoulder, and the masked man with a ventriloquist's voice took up his station in front of him, ready to smash his skull at the slightest movement. At the same time, Marius heard below him, at the base of the partition, but so near that he could not see who was speaking, this colloquy, conducted in a low tone. "There is only one thing left to do. Cut his throat! That's it." It was the husband and wife taking counsel together. Thénardier walked slowly towards the table, opened the drawer, and took out the knife. Marius fretted with the handle of his pistol. Unprecedented perplexity! For the last hour he had had two voices in his conscience, the one enjoining him to respect his father's testament, the other crying to him to rescue the prisoner. These two voices continued uninterruptedly that struggle which tormented him to agony. Up to that moment he had cherished a vague hope that he should find some means of reconciling these two duties, but nothing within the limits of possibility had presented itself. However, the peril was urgent, the last bounds of delay had been reached. Thénardier was standing thoughtfully a few paces distant from the prisoner. Marius cast a wild glance about him, the last mechanical resource of despair. All at once a shudder ran through him. At his feet, on the table, a bright ray of light from the full moon illuminated and seemed to point out to him a sheet of paper. On this paper he read the following line written that very morning in large letters by the eldest of the Thénardier girls: "The bobbies are here." An idea, a flash, crossed Marius's mind. This was the expedient of which he was in search, the solution of that frightful problem which was torturing him, of sparing the assassin and saving the victim. He knelt down on his commode, stretched out his arm, seized the sheet of paper, softly detached a bit of plaster from the wall, wrapped the paper round it, and tossed the whole through the crevice into the middle of the den. It was high time. Thénardier had conquered his last fears, or his last scruples, and was advancing on the prisoner. "Something is falling!" cried the Thénardier woman. "What is it?" asked her husband. The woman darted forward and picked up the bit of plaster. She handed it to her husband. "Where did this come from?" demanded Thénardier. "Pardi!" ejaculated his wife. "Where do you suppose it came from? Through the window, of course." "I saw it pass," said Bigrenaille. Thénardier rapidly unfolded the paper and held it close to the candle. "It's in Éponine's handwriting. The devil!" He made a sign to his wife, who hastily drew near, and showed her the line written on the sheet of paper. Then he added in a subdued voice, "Quick, the ladder! Let's leave the bacon in the mousetrap and decamp." "Without cutting that man's throat?" asked the Thénardier woman. "We haven't the time." "Through what?" resumed Bigrenaille. "Through the window," replied Thénardier. "Since Ponine has thrown the stone through the window, it indicates that the house is not watched on that side." The mask with the ventriloquist's voice deposited his huge key on the floor, raised both arms in the air, and opened and clenched his fists 3 times rapidly without uttering a word. This was the signal like the signal for clearing the decks for action on board ship. The ruffians who were holding the prisoner released him. In the twinkling of an eye the rope ladder was unrolled outside the window and solidly fastened to the sill by the 2 iron hooks. The prisoner paid no attention to what was going on around him. He seemed to be dreaming or praying. As soon as the ladder was arranged, Thénardier cried, "Come, the bourgeoise first!" and he rushed headlong to the window. But just as he was about to throw his leg over, Bigrenaille seized him roughly by the collar. "Not much! Come now, you old dog, after us!" "After us!" yelled the ruffians. "You are children," said Thénardier. "We are losing time. The police are on our heels." "Well," said the ruffians, "let's draw lots to see who shall go down first." Thénardier exclaimed: "Are you mad? Are you crazy? What a pack of boobies! You want to waste time, do you? Draw lots, do you? By a wet finger, by a short straw, with written names thrown into a hat?" "Would you like my hat?" cried a voice on the threshold. All wheeled round. It was Javert. He had his hat in his hand and was holding it out to them with a smile. End of Book 8, Chapter 20.
Chapters 21 and 22 of Book 8 of Les Misérables, Volume 3, by Victor Hugo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by May Lowe. Les Misérables, Volume 3, by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 8, The Wicked Poor Man. Chapter 21. One should always begin by arresting the victims. At nightfall, Javert had posted his men and had gone into ambush himself between the trees of the Rue de la Barrière des Gobelins, which faced the Gorbeau house on the other side of the boulevard. He had begun operations by opening his pockets and dropping into it the two young girls who were charged with keeping a watch on the approaches to the den. But he had only caged Azelma. As for Éponine, she was not at her post. She had disappeared, and he had not been able to seize her. Then Javert had made a point, and had bent his ear to waiting for the signal agreed upon. The comings and goings of the fiacres had greatly agitated him. At last, he had grown impatient, and, sure that there was a nest there, sure of being in luck, having recognized many of the ruffians who had entered, he had finally decided to go upstairs without waiting for the pistol shot. It will be remembered that he had Marius' pass-key. He had arrived just in the nick of time. The terrified ruffians flung themselves on the arms which they had abandoned in all the corners at the moment of flight. In less than a second, these 7 men, horrible to behold, had grouped themselves in an attitude of defence, one with his meat-axe, another with his key, another with his bludgeon, the rest with shears, pincers, and hammers. Thénardier had his knife in his fist. The Thénardier woman snatched up an enormous paving stone which lay in the angle of the window and served her daughters as an ottoman. Javert put on his hat again, and advanced a couple of paces into the room, with arms folded, his cane under one arm, his sword in its sheath. "Halt there," said he. "You shall not go out by the window. You shall go through the door. It's less unhealthy. There are 7 of you. There are 15 of us. Don't let's fall to collaring each other like men of Auvergne." Bigrenaille drew out a pistol which he had kept concealed under his blouse, and put it in Thénardier's hand, whispering in the latter's ear, "It's Javert. I don't dare fire at that man. Do you dare?" "Parbleu!" replied Thénardier. "Well then, fire!" Thénardier took the pistol and aimed at Javert. Javert, who was only 3 paces from him, stared intently at him and contented himself with saying, "Come now, don't fire. You'll miss fire." Thénardier pulled the trigger. The pistol missed fire. "Didn't I tell you so?" ejaculated Javert. Bigrenaille flung his bludgeon at Javert's feet. "You're the emperor of the fiends. I surrender." "And you?" Javert asked the rest of the ruffians. They replied, "So do we." Javert began again calmly. "That's right, that's good. I said so, you are nice fellows." "I only ask one thing," said Bigrenaille, "and that is, that I might not be denied tobacco while I am in confinement." "Granted," said Javert. And turning round and calling behind him, "Come in now!" A squad of policemen, sword in hand, and agents armed with bludgeons and cudgels, rushed in at Javert's summons. They pinioned the ruffians. This throng of men, sparely lighted by the single candle, filled the den with shadows. "Handcuff them all!" shouted Javert. "Come on!" cried a voice, which was not the voice of a man, but of which no one would have ever said, "It is a woman's voice." The Thénardier woman had entrenched herself in one of the angles of the window, and it was she who had just given vent to this roar. The policemen and agents recoiled. She had thrown off her shawl, but retained her bonnet. Her husband, who was crouching behind her, was almost hidden under the discarded shawl, and she was shielding him with her body, as she elevated the paving stone above her head with the gesture of a giantess on the point of hurling a rock. "Beware!" she shouted. All crowded back towards the corridor. A broad open space was cleared in the middle of the garret. The Thénardier woman cast a glance at the ruffians who had allowed themselves to be pinioned, and muttered in hoarse and guttural accents, "The cowards!" Javert smiled, and advanced across the open space which the Thénardier was devouring with her eyes. "Don't come near me," she cried, "or I'll crush you." "What a grenadier!" ejaculated Javert. "You've got a beard like a man, mother, but I have claws like a woman." And he continued to advance. The Thénardier, dishevelled and terrible, set her feet far apart, threw herself backwards, and hurled the paving stone at Javert's head. Javert ducked, the stone passed over him, struck the wall behind, knocked off a huge piece of plastering, and, rebounding from angle to angle across the hovel, now luckily almost empty, rested at Javert's feet. At the same moment, Javert reached the Thénardier couple. One of his big hands descended on the woman's shoulder, the other on the husband's head. "The handcuffs!" he shouted. The policemen trooped in force, and in a few seconds Javert's order had been executed. The Thénardier female, overwhelmed, stared at her pinioned hands, and at those of her husband, who had dropped to the floor, and exclaimed, weeping, "My daughters!" "They are in the jug," said Javert. In the meanwhile, the agents had caught sight of the drunken man asleep behind the door, and were shaking him. He awoke, stammering, "Is it all over, Jondrette?" "Yes," replied Javert. The 6 pinioned ruffians were standing, and still preserved their spectral mien. All 3 besmeared with black, all 3 masked. "Keep on your masks," said Javert, and, passing them in review, with a glance of a Frederick II at a Potsdam parade, he said to the 3 chimney builders, "Good day, Bigrenaille. Good day, Brujon. Good day, 2 Milliards." Then turning to the 3 masked men, he said to the man with the meat axe, "Good day, Gueulemer," and to the man with the cudgel, "Good day, Babet," and to the ventriloquist, "Your health, Claquesous." At that moment, he caught sight of the ruffian's prisoner, who, ever since the entrance of the police, had not uttered a word, and had held his head down. "Untie the gentleman," said Javert, "and let no one go out." That said, he seated himself with sovereign dignity before the table, where the candle and the writing materials still remained, drew a stamped paper from his pocket, and began to prepare his report. When he had written the first lines, which are formulas that never vary, he raised his eyes. Let the gentleman whom these gentlemen bound step forward. The policemen glanced round them. Well, said Javert, where is he? The prisoner of the ruffians, Monsieur Leblanc, Monsieur Urbain Fabre, the father of Ursule, or the Lark, had disappeared. The door was guarded, but the window was not. As soon as he had found himself released from his bonds, and while Javert was drawing up his report, he had taken advantage of confusion, the crowd, the darkness, and of a moment when the general attention was diverted from him, to dash out of the window. An agent sprang to the opening and looked out. He saw no one outside. The rope ladder was still shaking. "The devil!" ejaculated Javert between his teeth. "He must have been the most valuable of the lot." Chapter 22. The Little One Who Was Crying in Volume 2. On the day following that on which these events took place in the house on the Boulevard de l'Hôpital, a child, who seemed to be coming from the direction of the bridge of Austerlitz, was ascending the side alley on the right in the direction of the Barrière du Fontainebleau. Night had fully come. This lad was pale, thin, clad in rags, with linen trousers in the month of February, and was singing at the top of his voice. At the corner of the Rue du Petit Banquier, a bent old woman was rummaging in a heap of refuse, by the light of a street lantern. The child jostled her as he passed, then recoiled, exclaiming, "Hello!" and I took it for an enormous, enormous dog. He pronounced the word enormous the second time, with a jeering swell of the voice, which might be tolerably well represented by capitals. An enormous, enormous dog. The old woman straightened herself up in a fury. "Nasty brat!" she grumbled. "If I hadn't been bending over, I know well where I would have planted my foot on you." The boy was already far away. "Kiss, kiss!" he cried. "After that, I don't think I was mistaken." The old woman, choking with indignation, now rose completely upright, and the red gleam of the lantern fully lighted up her livid face, all hollowed into angles and wrinkles, with crow's feet meeting the corners of her mouth. Her body was lost in the darkness, and only her head was visible. One would have pronounced her a mask of decrepitude carved out by a light from the night. The boy surveyed her. "Madame," said he, "does not possess that style of beauty which pleases me." He then pursued his road, and resumed his song. "Les rois coups des sabots s'en allaient à la chasse aux corbeaux." At the end of these 3 lines he paused. He had arrived in front of numbers 50 to 52, and finding the door fastened, he began to assault it with resounding and heroic kicks, which betrayed rather the man's shoes that he was wearing than the child's feet which he owned. In the meanwhile, the very old woman whom he had encountered at the corner of the Rue du Petit Banquier hastened up behind him, uttering clamorous cries and indulging in lavish and exaggerated gestures. "What's this? What's this? Lord God, he's battering the door down! He's knocking the house down!" The kicks continued. The old woman strained her lungs. "Is that the way buildings are treated nowadays?" All at once she paused. She had recognized the gamin. "What! So it's that imp!" "Why, it's the old lady," said the lad. "Good day, Bougonmouche. I have come to see my ancestors." The old woman retorted with a composite grimace, and a wonderful improvisation of hatred taking advantage of feebleness and ugliness, which was, unfortunately, wasted in the dark. "There's no one here." "Bah!" retorted the boy. "Where's my father?" "At La Force." "Come now! And my mother? At Saint-Lazare. Well, and my sisters? At the Madelonettes. The lad scratched his head behind his ear, stared at Ma'am Bougon, and said, "Ah." Then he executed a pirouette on his heel. A moment later, the old woman, who had remained on the doorstep, heard him singing in his clear, young voice as he plunged under the black elm trees in the wintry wind. Le roi coup des sabots s'en allait à la chasse aux corbeaux, monte sur deux échasses. Quand on passait dessus, on lui payait 2 sous. End of Book 8, Chapters 21 and